Hello, welcome to episode 21 of the Making Noise podcast. My name is Adam Kanal. I'm your host. In today's episode, I had the absolute pleasure to speak with Alan Belkin. I discovered Alan's work through a PDF my friend had sent me called A Practical Guide to Music Composition. And the thing that really struck me about that document was he talked about aspects of music that is completely style neutral. Essentially, what features make up a quality piece of music. And I actually have written on my wall right here a piece of paper where I wrote down the different notes of the things he talked about. So some of the things in that PDF include foreground versus background, stability versus instability, balance, momentum, balance and length. Right, that's just within that document. And then he, in 2018, he wrote a book called Music Composition, Craft and Art. And in that book, he laid out all of these principles that he talks about, which you can find on his website as well. He is a very, very insightful and knowledgeable composer and instructor. He received degrees from McGill University and Juilliard, where he studied with David Diamond and Elliott Carter. We talked quite a bit about that in this episode. And now he's retired after teaching at the University of Montreal for, over 30 years, I think. He has a YouTube channel where he puts together a series of educational videos. So like right now, I think he's doing one on applied harmony. He's done others called modern harmony, counterpoint. There's a really interesting series for composers called Analysis for Composers. It's just so many really great and interesting stuff. And the thing that I like about what he talks about is I don't see anyone else saying these things. Like we talk about this in the episode, what makes a good beginning? What are the features required in order for a beginning to be successful? What makes a good ending? How does one effectively transition? And as I mentioned, all these things he talks about is completely style neutral. It's not like when you read Vincent Persichetti's book and it's based on chordal harmonies and everything like that. So it's applicable to any style of music that you're writing in. I would highly recommend check out his website and read the articles he has on there. A lot of really good pieces of advice. Check out his book and go to his YouTube channel. But other than that, watch this episode. Here's some of the things he has to say just in conversation. So I don't think there are any announcements for this week or for this episode. Yeah, I think we're good. So please like and subscribe. If the podcast isn't on any platform that you prefer, I will gladly add it. And I think that's all. So let's make some noise. My name is Adam Kanal, and I am a collaborative composer. Join me in the search for a career in classical music. This is the Making Noise podcast. I'm happy you're able to join me and we could have this conversation.
The internet is amazing. When I was a student, it would have been unbelievable to have a conversation with somebody in a different city, except by telephone, it would cost $100.
Oh, yeah.
And even then, when I went to Juilliard, which is like beginning of the 1980s, if I'd been able to I had to go there. To be there. Whereas, now, even apart from the pandemic, now we sort of do things online, Certainly composition is something you can teach online. Maybe not teaching voice or something, that's maybe different, but certainly something like composition is doable online. So, times have changed and for the better as far as that goes.
Yeah, that's so true. It's like you said, it's amazing that we have this resource and opportunity to easily connect with anyone.
Where are you?
I'm in Chicago, Illinois.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the internet, of course, also has a bad side, because crap can get out there an awful lot also. But, that's like any tool. If you think about it, when the radio sort of became common in the 1920s, right? Like, of course, everyone was amazed. Oh my God, I'm listening to a concert in another city. But at the same time, that also one of the things that made Hitler possible is if he hadn't been able to reach so many all those big masses of people, it wouldn't have done it. So, but that's any kind of tool that involves human interaction. We're a mix. humans. We're not black or white. We're mixed.
Yeah, there's a diversity amongst how we, at least through time, there's a diversity of how we can connect and stuff.
Yeah, but I also think I think even human nature is like, I don't believe that people are basically good or basically bad. I believe that we all have, to some extent, we have both of things in us. And
mm,
going to be that there's individual differences in the context and so. But I don't think that most Germans in the 1930s were awful people. I'm not talking about Hitler. I'm talking about just your average everyday people. But the context was us. It was much easier to be a member of the Nazi Party and so on. So on the other hand, I mean, it doesn't mean they were, like I said, it doesn't mean they were innately evil. But in other situations, you look at people and you find them being good, and it's not necessarily because they're so good. So I think we have the potential for both. I don't
mhm.
think that's so. I think that's what's wrong. A lot of stuff, a lot of political theories is sort of, they either think that human nature is basically everybody's nice and sweet, or that everybody's a monster. I don't think it's either one.
Mm.
The extremes are exceptions. Once in a while, again, I'm not talking about the Hitlers. I'm talking about the average people who just sort of went along with stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's yeah, like you said, the extremes are the exceptions where they sort of sit at the fringe
Yeah.
of society.
Do you know who Steven Pinker is?
The linguist, right?
Yeah, but he's also a cognitive psychologist, which is actually the more interesting part of it. Like me, he's about the same age I am, and he also came from Montreal. I'm not really a friend of his, but we know each other, we're acquainted.
Uh-huh.
And his books are very interesting because, he also, like me, doesn't have this black and white view of human nature. He sort of thinks there are all kinds of things that can push it in one direction or another one. And what his big interest has been is what kind of stuff will push the good side of human beings to come out more. We know that there are certain things that do that, and other things that definitely, don't make the good side of things come out. It's interesting stuff. He's just one of many people that I started to read a long, long time ago. I sort of realized that music is a human thing, and if you really want to understand music, you got to think about understanding people.
Mhm.
Because after all, music is for human beings, right? Like, I mean, I love my dog, but I don't notice him particularly being wonderful about music. I don't notice my dog just going bonkers like some piece that I think is wonderful, right? So, but humans, it's a human thing. So that means, like it or not, it's dependent to a large extent on how human nature works, how the human mind works. So I started getting interested in reading psychology books and stuff like that. I was amazed at how much I learned about music from reading these books that had nothing to do with music.
Mm.
Tinker doesn't discuss music in particular, and Daniel Kahneman is Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh, I know the book. I don't know him or who he is as a professional or anything.
Well, now he's much older now, but he's a very, very famous scholar in psychology, and also psychology as it relates to economics. He did lots of research, and his book is really, it's not a theory book. It's a book sort of talking about his research over decades and decades. And there's so many things in that again, he's not talking about music at all, but suddenly you sort of look at it and you think, hey, like that could apply to music. The one I always give to my students, which is a hoot, but it's true, is like in his book, he has a chapter about an experiment that was done with colonoscopy patients. Well, I don't know if you know anything about colonoscopy, but it's not my idea of a good time.
Yeah.
Like spending a half an hour like that, I don't know. I can think of more fun ways to spend the time. Anyway, so the experiment is this, okay, and it's a true experiment. It's like they take these patients who are having colonoscopies, okay, and they say, would you allow us to record it? And all we want you to do is please tell us like when it hurts a lot, and tell us when it doesn't hurt very much. So just keep us informed about, sort of more or less how you're feeling about the whole thing. Okay. So they record, I don't know, 30 or 50, however many. they record them. And the patients are saying, well, this part hurts a lot. That's not so bad. But here's the interesting part. So they go back and re-interview these patients a few months later. And what they remember has nothing to do with what actually happened. For example, if a patient had 28 minutes, let's say, of really, it was awful, it was so painful, but the last 2 or 3 minutes were okay, that's all right, not a big deal. If he had the opposite, 28 minutes, everything's fine, but the last 3 minutes were obvious, I'll never do that again, it was disgusting, and so on. So Kahneman draws from that what he calls the peak end idea. The idea that certain things in an experience stick out more than others. For example, the peak, the climax, and the end. I don't know about you, but when I heard that, I started thinking, music, climaxes, endings, it's pretty important if you want to write a good piece that the ending be successful. Because if the ending is not successful, the last thing your people are going to hear is sort of, so what? So the ending is, the peaks and the endings, those are really important moments. And his point was that the experience is a lot less independent of the duration and more a matter of when things happen, in the whole thing. So I thought, that I read that and I thought, yeah, I think that definitely applies to music. And, even in my book, I mentioned something about endings. It's odd because I've read most of the standard composition books, and none of them ever talks about endings, like how to end a piece successfully, which I always found was sort of bonkers. Like everybody who writes a piece comes to an end, right? Like nobody's written an infinite piece. Even the crazy like 15-hour pieces are not infinite. So at some point you're going to sort of wonder, okay, well, how do we end this convincingly? And then you get into like, hey, what is a convincing ending? And again, things like this Kahneman book sort of got me thinking about stuff that I never heard about in my music studies. And I had some good teachers, just like I thought, why hasn't anybody said anything about this? Like, this is weird. So it sort of gave me the idea, well, there are things you can say about endings. I just found that was such an interesting subject to get into. And many others like that. That's only one of them. But my point was, what's interesting is just reading this stuff, which was not for musicians or by musicians. These people may love music, but Kahneman is not a musician. Pinker is not a musician. I'm sure they have no idea what sonata form is or, anything that any musician would know. But yet they're talking about stuff that's so important to people, the way human experience works. It's like, when you start thinking about it, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. Like, this is relevant to music. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff in there. Anyway, so it's just, it was an interesting turning point because I had a pretty good training up to there. But then I was sort of teaching university, and I have this rule of pedagogy that says, if you know 90% of your subject, okay, and you don't know 10% of it, when you're teaching it, it's guaranteed that a student will ask you a question in the 10% that you don't know. Okay, so you have two choices. Either you say to the student, I'm going to think about that and I'll get back to you, or you sort of slough them off. So obviously, the better solution is to just think about it and get back to them. And that started happening gradually. And I found myself like being able to base things on so instead of saying, well, just do it this way because that's the way you're supposed to do it, which is a shitty answer. You don't really learn anything from that. So they're saying, well, actually, the reason for this is such and such. When you start thinking about it, it could lead you to this or that. And we're just so enriching. It's just an enriching way to start looking at the whole thing. So, a lot of it, I say, just comes from other areas or other fields or other kinds of reading and so on. Like, oh, wow, interesting.
This is exactly what I love about your work and all of the writings you've done. So I've shown your book on here before, but like this book right here, you mentioned the chapter on endings. There's a chapter on beginnings, and you talk about aspects of composition that, like you said, I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about, like how to convincingly create a transition or a climax or the proportions between that, and so what was the other one? A practical guide for music composition.
There are a lot of PDF books. There's one on harmony, one on orchestration, so those are free on my website. But
right.
This one is published by Yale. It's not too expensive, but anyway. But the thing was, I remember I must have been like 15 or 16 years old, so I composed a little bit, but I didn't know anything. I was still a piano student. But I remember, like, when I would learn pieces, there are sections like climaxes were always sort of strike me, like, wow. And I started reading all these composition textbooks, and nobody ever said one word about a climax. I'm just thinking, like, well, why? Why are we, like, how come we don't talk about the most obvious thing? It's just very weird that we're not, it's just very weird. Nobody mentions it. So it's sort of, as time went on, I started thinking, well, somebody should mention it. Maybe it's about time we do talk about stuff like that, because if I can't be the only one who noticed those things. I don't think it's because my hearing is so much more subtle than everybody else.
Right.
It's just, people haven't just sort of talked about it. So, that got me to the point where I thought, well, maybe it's time to think about talking about that. And sometimes my own teachers would sometimes, like, when I was at Juilliard, I studied mainly with David Diamond, but I had maybe 4 or 5 lessons with Elliott Carter. Like, one year Diamond was on sabbatical, so I had lessons with Carter. So at one point, I had this, what brought in the beginning of this piece, was sort of like a long pedal tone with it in innuendo. And Carter said something like, well, don't start a piece with it in innuendo. I never thought about that before. And then I started thinking, yeah, of course, I can see why, because the diminuendo was a loss of energy. If you really want to start your piece with a long slowing down, getting higher. That's not a great beginning. You know what I mean? It doesn't get everybody's interest up. And that sort of got me thinking about a lot, not just dynamics, but a lot of other things like, okay, what makes a good beginning? And once you have the question, I mean, the answers are everywhere. Like Mozart knew how to make a good beginning, and so did Beethoven, and so did Bach. I mean, but nobody ever talked about it. So once you start looking, like there's a zillion answers to those questions, but you have to ask the question first. If you don't ask the question, nobody's going to give a shit about finding the answer, you know? So it's just got me thinking, you know, things like that. Somebody would make one remark, and I think, oh yeah, what did I, you know, and I sort of take, you know, I think it's important if you're studying, assuming you have a decent teacher, like the student has to, I call it running with the ball. You know, it's like you get the ball, but then don't just sit there saying, oh, I guess I have a ball here. You know what, do something, move, run with it, find out something else. And then you get the kind of student that's always the most fun, is the student that not only gets what you're saying, and they say, and what about such and such? Does that apply? You know, and then before you know it, you've got a whole, it's blossoming. It's just so much fun teaching people like that. I've had a lot of students like that, and they're a blast to work with, you know, because it gives me ideas too, because sometimes they think of things that I haven't thought of. And all of a sudden, I think, yeah, that's cool, you know, before you know it. And again, sometimes it's outside of music. I mean, I have one friend who's also a student, you know, he's very interested in language learning. He's learning Japanese right now, this fellow. So we got into, I mean, I don't know anything about Japanese. We got into stuff about languages and just all kinds of subjects that, you know, off the beaten path, but fascinating, just totally, you know, fascinating stuff. So, you know, I figure it was a kind of cool. So music can lead you down strange paths sometimes.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things I find kind of funny. It almost feels like a Saturday Night Live sketch where how the way you came upon how to understand your music was learning about colonoscopies.
Right. Yeah. You think about that, you think, yeah, right, sure. I mean, it does sound funny. And a lot of it is funny, except when you really start thinking about it, like the point is obviously not the colonoscopy. The point is what we remember. And music is all about memory. You know, I mean, when you write music, if you don't appeal to the person's memory at all, it's not going to have much of an impact, you know, because music is all about patterns in sound, and we develop expectations about those patterns, and then maybe they get fulfilled or not, that depends. But that's what the composer is playing with. And even something really simple like a deceptive cadence, I mean, the whole point is you have a certain expectation and, oh, how come it went over there instead of there? But that keeps your interest up, you know? I mean, I sometimes compare this, like, even if like you're reading a thriller, I mean, just a cheap spy novel or something. I mean, the one thing even that kind of novel has to do well is keep you turning the pages, right? So you don't give the reader the answers to all the questions on page 10, because then there's no reason to go on. So maybe you give the answer to one question, but you lead to another question, because you always find some way to sort of keep things moving along, you know, keep the interest. It's like, I call it yes, but. It's like, you know, okay, this is true, but there's also, and then you think, yeah, okay, yeah, go, like, you know, because it makes you need to have that kind of curiosity. But, you know, again, if there's no perceptible patterns at all, I don't know about you, but I tend to give up after a few moments, like, okay, it's just random, I don't care. No. So anyway, for me, that's a big part of music.
Yeah, I think that's one area where you and I might diverge a little bit, because there's music like Chelsea, who it's, you know, where you're kind of sitting on one note and then he offsets it by a microtone, and like sort of being that immersive experience. And
but that's, I mean, even minimal music to me has to evolve in some area. In other words, if you just had one note electronically played that lasted for 20 minutes, I think you'd get pretty bored. Okay. As soon as it starts to evolve, you're thinking, oh, okay, what's happening? The pitch is changing, or the timbre is changing, whatever. Because I think that even though minimal music is minimal in one or two dimensions, I think if it's minimal in every dimension, then it's probably not going to keep your interest.
Right.
Or something has to evolve, and so that it still means that the world is smaller, but you can still have curiosity and like things that sort of, oh, what's that? You know, once you have that reaction, you're on the right track. Like you're sort of, you know, okay, what happened over there? Where's that going? That's all you need. That doesn't make it a great piece, but I mean, at least you have the minimum, I think, from music to, you know, from music to sort of have an effect.
Yeah, this makes me think about you know, the actor Tom Hardy?
Yeah.
He did a movie called Locke. Have you ever seen that?
No, didn't see it. No.
So Locke is this, like, it's a short film, like maybe I don't know, 60 or 80 minutes. And
Okay.
the entire film just takes place inside his car, and he's driving from his job to a hospital.
Right.
And it's only him the whole time. So like the setting is minimal, and
Right.
there's no, action that's taking place. But what pushes the story along is from the beginning of the drive to the end of the drive, he has to make a series of phone calls that
Okay.
alters the path of his life.
Okay, so there is some kind of progression in there. It's just it's not the geographical progression that's important. It's the psychological. So I mean, that's the same. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, even reducing the music in one or more dimensions to a very small amount, if the rest of it is very rich, can actually be a good thing because it helps you focus. It's like I say, you don't want every dimension of music to be poor at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of the other things I really like about what you talk about, and you mentioned this in your book too, is that this sort of approach by thinking about the way we psychologically understand things, looking for patterns or where the patterns are broken, is that it's style neutral.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not style specific.
Yeah, because I was aware, like these days when people study composition, some people want to write quote unquote classical music. Contemporary classical, but a lot of people are looking to write film music or video game music, a lot of other stuff. And in fact, I would say, there's more people, you certainly have a better chance of earning a living writing film music or video game music than you do writing contemporary classical music. You're more likely to get a salary. And the students of mine who have done the best sort of in career ways, surprise, surprise, have gone in those directions. Okay. So I think for those people, there's no law that says all video game music has to be one style. In fact, quite the contrary, often you want more than one style. The same thing for film music. However, you have to include the classic, if you can't write any tonal music, you're screwed as a film composer. You need to be able to write tonal music, but you have to be able to do other stuff too. So what I'm thinking is what are there principles that could apply? I don't want to say to every kind of music in the world, because that's a really big, statement, but certainly, the most music that people find interesting. And, I think these are the principles that, in my mind, are the ones that go beyond style. Obviously, the classical style applies these things by definition. Like you have to think of endings in classical style and climaxes and so on. But those things apply also to things that are not just classical style pieces. So that's the part, I think I wanted the book not to be just one thing, because most of the composition books I've read tend to be sort of, okay, you're learning about classical music, which is okay as far as it goes, but it's sort of leaving out, half or more of the student population. And also a lot of student population. I've never been big on pop music, but I don't have to tell you that more people are big on pop music than on classical music. And if you write something that they can relate to, it's definitely a plus. And pop music has climaxes and, endings and so forth.
Yeah. There's something about understanding like the things that you talk about, like the way that music unfolds, and applying that to whatever sort of style that you're working within.
Right.
And one of the things that I remember you mentioning is coherence.
Right.
Or in order for a successful piece, it has to be coherent.
Right.
And that's something where even in pop music, like these short little 3-minute long songs,
Right.
There's usually not a lot of divergence that it goes away from, also because it's not too long.
Right.
Unlike a Mahler symphony or something.
Right. Well, generally speaking, the amount of novelty is proportional to the length of the piece. Was in a 1-minute piece, you're not likely to have 5 different ideas. If only because imagine we were talking for 5 minutes and we had 75 different subjects of conversation. Like, what? At a certain point, you just, if all of a sudden we're talking about Afghanistan, then we're talking about China, and then we're talking about cooking in Singapore, like, huh? You just sort of tune out, right? But you need to focus a certain amount. But by the same token, if you talk for an hour, you're likely to have more subjects than if you talk for 2 minutes. So I think that it's almost common sense in a way. Short pieces tend to be more limited. There's a nice famous comment by Stravinsky. I don't remember the exact words, but it's something like he finds that constraints inspire him, like they give him good ideas. Just knowing, whereas instead of thinking, well, I can do anything at all, which in a way is sort of nothing, sort of like, well, this has to be, 6 minutes long for viola and piano or whatever, I don't know, and it's for a performer who wants a very dense, like, I don't know, I'm just making stuff up, but, just having some kind of constraint is actually more stimulating, more likely to get you thinking, why would I do that? What's an interesting way to do that? And just saying, okay, do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
So I always thought it was kind of a cool comment.
Yeah, sort of controlling or setting limitations on yourself.
Yeah. And if you think about it, any music that you'd like to enjoy has some kind of, like, whether it's style or whether it's the material. I mean, I can't imagine a piece having no constraints. I mean, the few pieces that I can think of where they try to sort of do everything, in my mind, are just failures. I don't think they succeed very well. Just because after a while, it's like, yeah, but this is just random bullshit. I don't care anymore. My opinion, anyway. There was, for a while, there was a period in the 60s and the 70s where sort of you shouldn't use motives, you shouldn't do consonants, and all these things you weren't supposed to do. This was at the post-war generation. But the trouble is they told you not to do these things, but they never gave you anything to replace them. Like motive, there's a reason that motives are important, because they're recognizable little bits. And when they come back, you go, oh, yes. Okay, if you don't want to use motives, fine. So what are you going to use instead to give me things I can recognize? It's not impossible, but there's no point just saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, if you have nothing to substitute for it. Otherwise, that's just, then you're just talking about it like it's a fashion, like, oh, today, now the fashion to wear long pants or short pants, like, who cares? It's just random crap. So, once you get into, like, most of these things, these sort of in classical conventions do have reasons behind them, which doesn't mean you have to use them, but if you're going to not use them, you should know why they're there and find another way to get the result, achieve the thing that they achieve. That's what I think, anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. That's like, knowing the rules well enough to break them in a way, or at least finding an alternative, I guess.
It's more, I think it's more than rules. I think it's about principles. More like general principles, like, all that stuff about parallel octaves and direct octaves and so on. I mean, the real principle is not to have holes in the texture. You don't want a texture suddenly feeling like empty for a moment, okay? That's the real question. Now, obviously, what sounds empty in a Prokofiev piano sonata is not the same thing that sounds empty in a Mozart sonata, okay? In other words, you could take things that in a Mozart sonata would sound rich and put them in Prokofiev, and they would sound empty because Prokofiev has so much dissonance all over the place. So it's context dependent. But this idea, I call it bumps and holes. Like most musical problems are either a bump or something happens like, huh? Like, and it doesn't seem to make any sense, or it's a hole, like, okay, already, like, enough, sort of saying the same thing. Okay, right, got it. Okay, I think that covers most problems in musical form that you see. It's either a bump or a hole. If something sticks out too much or something gets boring.
It's funny hearing you say this, because it makes me think about the first time I had seen Beethoven's Fifth performed live. Oh, yeah. There was a Q&A beforehand, and I asked the conductor, and I don't remember who the conductor was or anything, but I asked him about oh boy, what spot is I can't remember if it's the oboe.
Yeah, the oboe solo, yeah.
And I think I asked him something along the lines of, like, was Beethoven trying to simulate a mistake or something like that? And this was years ago. And I remember reading in one of your it was the harmony text or the orchestration one, and you talked about that exact section.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you imagine we were living at that time. Okay, obviously we've listened to a lot of other stuff, but imagine if all we heard was Mozart and Haydn, and there you get this symphony that, like, within the first minute, da 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 dum dum da, there's one note holding on, and the rest of the chord goes away. You think, like, what? Already it seems pretty weird. So already he's kind of saying, look, something weird. Now, after that, there's two possibilities. Either he's just going to go on, in which case it just sounds like it was a mistake, or at some point he's going to pick it up and do something wonderful with it. And that's what he does. So the second time it happens, it leads to that oboe solo. So that interruption, which is so weird and puzzling at the beginning, suddenly it's like, wow, all of a sudden the new emotion that is not anywhere else present in that movement, just sort of sad oboe solo. And that's what makes it work. If he had done the oboe solo without that, it would just sound like, what the fuck is that doing in there? Like, why is that? So it's a way. I mean, it's a way of creating a sort of an anomaly, and it's a very kind of original idea. Because, I mean, can you imagine if you were listening at that time, we saw the orchestra holding that G? Yeah, okay, like, what's the matter? The conductor had a stroke or what? What's going on? And then on the other, and Beethoven does that in other pieces too. But I mean, that's the kind of thing he was exploring. And the interesting, of course, when Beethoven explored, it wasn't just random stuff. It was always stuff that was expressively very powerful. Because in the Baroque period, there was this what they call the principle of unity of affect, and it was a piece had basically one emotion. Right? In the same movement, you didn't have, let's say, Martial and Sat. They didn't belong in the same movement. But in the classical period, Mozart and Haydn and the others, they start combining different emotional states in the same piece. Now, that's easy to say, but it's not easy to do because you have to do it in a way that makes sense. It doesn't mean you stick 10 minutes of slow stuff in the middle of an allegro. That's not going to do the trick. So you have to set it up in such a way that seems like it belongs there. And that took quite a lot of doing till they kind of figured out how to do those kind of transitions. Beethoven does the most dramatic transitions of anybody up to that time, but they're always emotionally successful. They're not just like, why is he doing that weird thing? Because it's easy to do weird stuff. That's not hard. Anybody can invent weird stuff, but to make it worth hearing, I could say, well, let's play a cello piece. We'll fill the cello up with honey, and we'll do that. Well, that's very nice, but I'm not sure it's going to be musically of any interest to anybody. You probably have an angry cellist also afterward. Right? So I mean, it's easy to be sort of new that way, but like, so what?
Right.
Like you want something that if you do something, you better have a reason that's going to people are going to go, wow, that's something, as opposed to like.
Well, okay, so I have a couple of thoughts, and I was wondering, can I sort of throw some questions at you about specific aspects of what makes a successful beginning, what makes a successful climax? Do you think you can kind of give a little concise response for that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say everything, but sure, yeah.
So in large scale works, or maybe let's go a little, I guess, well, no, in general, I guess we could just go in general. What would you say is a convincing or a successful opening for a piece of music that's like maybe 10 to 15 minutes long?
Well, I think any piece of any length, but even more so if it's longer. I think, so I just want to take the cough off. I think any opening has to get you interested. So what gets people interested? Usually curiosity of some kind. Like, now you may not think about it that way, but think of the Mozart Jupiter, dum, dum, dum. So you have something really forceful and something very lyrical, but like in 2 seconds apart. Okay. So your first thing is like, yeah, okay, like you want to see what are they doing together. It's a contrast that sort of gives you think, okay, again, you don't think of it intellectually, but it kind of grabs your interest, So anything that sort of manages to grab your interest, usually it'll either be some kind of like a progression, which is incomplete, like sort of, let's say a crescendo that stops, and then you think, okay, now what? Okay, or it could be something like putting like the Mozart, putting two ideas side by side in a very short space. That's like, if I said to you something like, today I want to talk about musical form and cancer in China. Well, then you're thinking, what's that? You're already sort of wondering, I mean, either I'm talking crap, or maybe you have an interesting connection you haven't thought of. Okay? So that's basically the idea for beginning. You have to get people curious.
I like that description, musical form and cancer in China.
Yeah, I mean, right, two things that you don't think, why do they belong together? But then, oh yeah, then you start, if the piece is any good, I'll start seeing, oh yeah, that's what they have to do with each other, and you go on from there. So I would say curiosity is the main thing for a beginning. And curiosity means some kind of pattern that is not totally finished. If you wanted to start a beginning with 5-1, like a dominant to tonic chord, root position, perfect authentic cadence, it's not a great beginning, because it sort of seems like, okay, it's the end. Now you can trick the listener. Beethoven's First Symphony does that. Also for the 5-1, but it's in F major. But then right away you have a 5-1 in C major. So are you thinking like, okay, which key is it? There was in some way you create curiosity. To me, that's the sense of a good beginning.
Okay. Now, what about a convincing climax?
Climax is easy. Climax, by definition, is the most intense point, right? So that means it has to be led up to by some kind of progression. I don't mean harmony progression. I mean probably like registers getting higher, dynamics are getting louder, tempo is getting faster, some kind of thing where you sense something is accumulating in a certain direction, and then you sort of feel like it's finally reached as far as it can go. Right? That's the definition of a climax. By definition, it isn't something that's already happened, but it's fulfilling something. Like if you just put a high note in the middle of a soft passage, it's not going to sound like a climax, it's going to sound like a mistake. And when it's a climax, it's an extreme that's been properly led up to.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I recall you talking about, where the proportions are really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, depending on the size of the P, obviously, climax for a Mahler symphony is going to be longer than climax in a Chopin prelude. It's one page.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the same principle.
Yeah. One of my favorite examples of I mean, there's obviously countless, but Sibelius Two. Is it Sibelius Two? Is that the one in D major?
Yeah, yes.
And the finale, the third movement going into the finale.
Yeah, it's wonderful stuff. He was pretty good, Sibelius. It's funny because Sibelius is often considered a traditional composer, but actually he's one of the most original composers who ever lived. Just because he called this piece symphony, you'll sort of assume that's traditional. But if you look at the form, there's nothing traditional about it, nothing conventional about it. He's trying interesting stuff all the time. Yeah, he was. There's lots of interesting stuff in Sibelius like that. Fourth Symphony also does some very unusual stuff, and it's like, wow,
Yeah. Even like when I start digging into his scores too, there's so much in there that you might not hear on first listening, and then you see it in the score. You're like, wait, what is this?
Yeah. But it catches you emotionally though.
It does. It totally does.
Yeah, I mean, you may not analyze. I mean, I don't think it's important to analyze music on first listening anyway. Like, I mean, I'm interested in analyzing a piece if I've already listened to it and I like it. Then I'm curious because I'm a musician. I'll say, well, how did he do that? So then I'll want to analyze it, but I don't want to analyze first and then listen. Like, if the piece is a good piece, I don't need to analyze it. And if it's a lousy piece, analyzing first won't make me like it any better. I'll just be sort of, why are you wasting my time with all this blabbing when the piece sounds like shit? So either way, and for me, analysis comes, if I've listened to it, I enjoy it, then I'm curious, okay, what did he do? How did he get that? And then I'm taking it apart.
Yeah, that could be a tricky thing sometimes, is listening to a new piece and not analyzing it,
Yeah, but I mean, if it doesn't get, I mean, here again, that guy Kahneman, the psychologist guy, that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, one of the basic ideas of the book is says we have two kinds of thinking. One of them is what he would call system one, which is the fast kind. System one is the stuff you do, like you go to the grocery store, you meet somebody in the street and you say hi. Now, you did not spend 10 minutes thinking, what are the pros and cons of saying hi to the grocery store clerk? You know what I mean? It's just automatic. You don't even think about it. And most of the time in our life, that's what we do. Well, system one, it's sort of, you don't reflect on it. System two is when you sort of say, wait a minute, I have to really think this over carefully. Unlike big decisions in your life, you should use a little system two. Otherwise you can get yourself royally screwed by just following your impulses. Sometimes it's a good idea, but not always, okay? So that's why it's called thinking fast and slow, okay? So the fast is system one. It's like the stuff that's like that. And the slow is like you're saying, wait a minute, I got to think about this. Well, music takes place in time, right? Like piece will not pause for 5 minutes while you analyze it. So when you're listening to the piece for the first time, I figure like if it doesn't get you in your system one, frankly, it's not a good sign. It doesn't mean you have to love everything about it in every second, but if nothing in the piece sort of gets you feeling like excited or moved or something, it's not off to a good start, in my opinion. Then you may decide to apply your system two. Obviously, also, somebody with musical training, and obviously, if I listen to a tonal piece, I don't need to do a lot of analysis to recognize the appropriate bending cadence when I hear one, right? That's sort of, and I know what the French horn is and what the trump, it's not even analysis. That's become system one for me because I've been doing it for so long, right? But if I really anything sort of more than just obvious stuff like that, so I think, okay, let's have a look at that. And then I'm using my system two, but you can't listen to music with system two because it doesn't stop and wait. It's going to keep going whether you like it or not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's an article I read a while ago about the perception of time or the experience of time, and talking about how it like went through sort of the historical philosophical ideas of how time was understood.
Yeah.
And one of the things was talking about how at the point in which you start to think about what happens, it's already in the past, and what's happening now.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what it said. Yeah, I'm definitely not going to be clear on what I'm saying right now, but you're making me think about that article.
Well, it's a little bit like the colonoscopy thing. And it was while the people were having the colonoscopy, the duration of feeling shitty counted. 20 minutes of feeling shitty matters. But in their memory afterward, that's the interesting part. What matters is when the shitty part happened and not how long it took. That's the part that was surprising in people's reactions. So, music has something to learn from that too. But duration itself, I mean, unless it's crazy, I'm not talking about, a piano piece that lasts 5.5 hours. But I mean, your average piece, I mean, duration itself is less important than the highlights, the things that stick out that you remember. The contrast effects, you know what contrast effects are in psychology. If it rains for 10 days and then it's sunny, so, oh my God, finally the sun is up. If it's sunny for 10 days, you don't even notice it anymore because we notice what contrasts with what just happened. Music is full of that stuff. Like it's all over the place in music, right? And so much of the most effective music just makes effective use of contrast effects. It's just a simple example, but the most common beginner's mistake in orchestration is too much doubling. The problem with too much doubling is it's okay, but after a while, you've killed all the contrast effects. If the strings and the winds of the brass are playing all the time, you never use the contrast. If you have the strings alone for 2 minutes and then the brass comes in, it's like, wow. But if they've been playing all along, it's like, okay, so what? I mean, it's idiotically simple, but it really applies.
Yeah, and I know, what, especially as student composers, like getting into writing something so massive, especially for the first time, it's like it's a big undertaking. But also, even as a creative person in general, in the middle of the process of trying to make a new piece of art, it's so easy to sort of lose sight of the forest,
Yeah, that's the kind of thing. Again, a little bit of psychology knowledge goes a long way. But just knowing how important contrast effects are, I mean, this does not require any fancy knowledge about special effects or anything. Just like sometimes have the winds shut up for a while. And when they come back, it's going to be more interesting than if they're playing all the time. It's that simple.
Right.
There are other more complicated ones, but I mean, that's the simplest example, and it's relevant to all kinds of orchestration. I don't care what style you're in. If you don't use contrast effects, it's like you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're not using some of the most prominent and most useful stuff that you can use. It's a ridiculously basic fact of human psychology.
It's interesting how it seems like from what I've noticed, at least with student composers, is it's often like either too much variety or not enough variety.
Got it.
It's like kind of one of both extremes.
Right. Yeah, too much variety very often comes from too much analysis. Like people confuse what you can see. Let's say you can see the retrograde version of something much more easily than hearing it. You take some theme and put it in retrograde, so the rhythmic values are all backwards, it's going to sound pretty different. So you're less likely to go, oh yeah, on the paper, it's really easy to see it. But that's a common mistake. That people do analysis looking at the score, and they think that if somebody points out the retrograde inversion, oh yeah, that's really important. And if nobody notices when they hear it, who cares?
Right. See, this is another thing that you talk about where I haven't heard anyone else say this sort of stuff. And
it's ridiculous. I also found, well, I keep saying, I mean, I'm interested in what I can hear. And your music is meant to be heard. So I don't care what you say on paper and all the blah, blah, blah that goes with your stuff, may be fine. But when I listen to it, if none of it is, like, I think there are 3 levels. There's some stuff that you notice right away, okay? Like, let's say if you have the whole orchestra playing and suddenly you have the flute solo, everybody's going to notice that. You don't need a doctorate in musicology to pick up on that.
Right,
okay?
right.
Obvious contrast, right? Then there's some stuff like I say, the retrograde inversion of the first theme occurs in measure 374 for the first time, and it's in the bassoon part, which is in the middle of 10 other woodwinds. I don't know about you, but like I could listen to it 20 times and I would never notice that. Right. It's just no way. So those are the 2 extremes. And then there's stuff like that you sort of notice more training you have. Like certain things, like again, I'll notice a perfect cadence or an imperfect cadence or whatever, just because I have that training, so I'll pick up on it. The untrained listener might feel different degrees of punctuation, but they won't know what to call it. Okay, so it's sort of there's different degrees of salience. Like some things are just impossible to ignore. Other things, like I say, it's written on the page, but nobody will ever hear it. So some of the problem with people, the student composition, is that they mistake unity from visible things to audible things. and mixing up the two, right? So just because you can see something, 500 bars later, does not in any way mean that when you listen to the piece consecutively and 500 bars later is 15 minutes later, not at all sure you're going to make that connection. You have to really rearrange it to make the connection, not just assume everybody's going to pick up on the weighted version and measure 5/75.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's something that I learned from one of my composition instructors. I actually mentioned this in the last episode. Is she has this great idea about when you write out a version of the piece, however long it is, she takes color pencils and then will circle a specific like whether it's a dynamic motive or a rhythmic motive or a pitch motive, and so that color corresponds to that specific motive. And if you see it in the beginning like color red and then measure 575, you see color red again, then it's like, okay, there's no one's going to notice that connection because it's so far apart.
Too far apart. There are ways to make you notice it. You can set up measure 575 as a real turning point. You make a big climax and you have a pause before it. And then the red thing is what you just heard right at the beginning. Then you might connect because it's sort of saying, hey, look over there. There's something coming. Got that? Watch, look over there. You're setting up the listener. But if it's just in the middle of the other stuff, no, it doesn't. It's useless.
Right. There's too much fluff around it to make it.
You're distracted. You can't remember 100 things at the same time. It's that simple. That's another reason for motives, to give you something to focus on as opposed to like everything. Telling somebody you should notice everything it's sort of like saying don't notice anything because it's so vague. The example I always give is the piano teacher. All they have to say is, you're playing. You could play better. Well, frankly, I don't need a teacher to tell me that. I know. Give me details. Give me details. Like how? What am I supposed to do? Where? If you just yeah, sure. If you tell me my composition should be better, yes, I agree with you. Okay, where? Give me a suggestion. Measure what? What am I supposed to do? I might not even agree with the suggestion, but at least we have something to talk about. You just say this composition could be better. Yeah, I agree. No problem with it, but nobody's learned anything.
Yeah, that's not a good teacher.
Nope. Yeah. That's why I wrote on my website, I have that letter to a young composer. And I wrote that based on experiences of my own, just, where a bad teacher really set me back, a couple of bad teachers really set me back a few years. And that letter is a way of sort of maybe helping people avoid the same problem. Not sort of have the kind of problems that I have just because basically the teacher was not doing their job properly.
That's something else too that I want to let for people who don't know who you are. On your website, you have all these great resources. Like the letter to a young composer. You have a tab titled "On Musical Ideas." Right. There's one on salience, and then and there's the whole series on orchestration, harmony, counterpoint. Isn't there one on musical creativity? Is it called or?
Not exactly, but anyway, yeah. But I mean, anyway, these are just essays I wrote at different times, and I still thought maybe this will be interesting to a reasonable number of people, and it turns out that they are.
Absolutely, yeah. I've benefited a lot from them. I mean, the works that I've written in the last few years since I've learned about you, though I've applied a lot of the principles you've talked about with proportions and the psychology of how we understand and experience things.
I'm glad. When I started all this, I mean, the book, that book from Yale was only published in 2018. That's not too old, but I started teaching university, like 40 years ago. It was like 30 years old. Okay. And in that time, there wasn't even the internet didn't exist at that time, right? So, okay. Your thing, and like I said, I had some good teachers at Juilliard, and I was teaching and learning, like I said before, from questions people asked when I was teaching. Anyway, fine. Then the internet comes along, right? And this is like 15 years later. So now we're like 1995. It's beginning to be used like more commonly. Okay, it's not like it is today, but I mean, people are starting to have heard of the internet. You can go on AOL or whatever. Have your account. Fine. So I started thinking about what would be interesting. That certain kinds of things like a subject like harmony, tonal harmony, let's say, doesn't change a lot from one year to the next. It's pretty much the same stuff you're teaching every year. So why not record it once, put it online, and you can save the teacher having to give the same lecture every single year. and just have the teacher spend more time with the students looking at their work, as opposed to having just repeat the same stuff I've been repeating for 15 years now, So that was the first thing. But, at that point, I even proposed at the university, but they weren't really interested at that point. I don't think they saw the potential of it. Okay. Things went on, and then now we're getting to the 2000s, and, eventually, like everybody else, I jumped Facebook and, all this stuff, and, the web and YouTube and everything. So I thought at a certain point, maybe I should sort of start putting stuff up on YouTube. Okay. This is like 2013, maybe. Okay. So at first, of course, I had a channel, but I mean, like, I had like 3 people following me. I mean, I put something up, and like in a week, 4 people would look at it. Okay. All right. But, but as time went on, I sort of improved it. And since it's free, it was sort of, it started getting more people. So now I have like 24,000 subscribers. Like if you told me that in 2013, I would have thought, hey, you're crazy.
Yeah.
But, it's obviously, I seem to be saying stuff that is not the same as what everybody else is saying, and people seem to find useful. So to me, that's very fulfilling, because I mean, I always liked teaching. I mean, I'm a composer, but I've always had fun teaching. Teaching for me is not just a way to make a living. It's just something I really enjoyed, and I've always enjoyed it. There are good musicians who don't like teaching, but I like teaching. So, since I enjoy teaching, that's a nice way to teach, to reach out to people much farther than the local circuit. So, as that sort of became a bigger and bigger thing, I started putting up more videos. And then I retired about 5 years ago, so I had more time. Okay, I'm doing all these, apply counterpoint, harmony, and so on online. So the result is I have more time, and I want to put stuff up. And like I said before, I'm just trying to talk about stuff that other people are not talking about. I don't need to repeat. Nobody needs me to repeat exactly the same thing that everybody else has said. But if I have something to say that is not so common, like, okay, that might be worth like putting up, and people seem to find it of interest and find useful. So I'm happy that, that's very satisfying to me. And now even if I put up one of my pieces on my channel, like, in 2 days, I'll get 1,000 views, whereas in those days it was 3.
Right.
Just because, people are interested, so all these people subscribing. So, that's pretty rewarding. And of course, COVID, nobody predicted COVID, but I mean, COVID has certainly pushed all that a lot farther for obvious reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is interesting because it definitely ties back to what we were talking about earlier about at the very beginning of our conversation about the ability to do this and reach a lot of people in a short amount of time, actually immediately, really.
I've had another funny experience, which is, like all through my career, I've always tended, every year I'd make friends with 1 or 2 students, and we'd stay friends, not all of them, but 1 or 2, so, and with the result that, since my career started, 40 years ago, some of the students in question are now like 60 years old, and some of them are 40, and some of them are, 20, the ones from recently. So I have these friends of different ages, and I've always enjoyed that, But the online thing has also been interesting, because I've met people from all over the world we become friends. I have a good friend in Switzerland, but I'm learning German. So with him, I talk German. It's a chance to practice my German, right? Well, again, the only way we could possibly have known each other was online, as we met each other during COVID. And, but we're in touch regularly, and we have nice chats about music and all kinds of other things. And I have friends in other countries. It's just, again, none of this would have happened. I mean, I'm just glad I didn't retire like 35 years ago, before the internet was around, because my retirement would have been much more impoverished. I couldn't have been able to meet these people, wouldn't have been able to teach all these people. So it's a blast.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's really great time and opportunity to be able to utilize that.
To do stuff like this, it's been a lot of fun for me. That's what I enjoy, because I don't make much money when I teach individually, I make some money, but put the courses up online, basically that's Patreon, but most of it goes to the guy who does my web programming and stuff. But I'm not doing it for the money. Like I don't care. The main thing is the reward for me is feeling that people find it useful. That's good.
Yeah, it's definitely doing that. So you're still teaching privately?
Yeah. I've students from a little bit all, again, because of COVID, I don't see too many people in person, but definitely have students all over the place. I mean, students in China, Australia, and Germany, America, you name it, sort of all over the place.
Right. Yeah. That with the things you talk about on your channel and everything like that. I mean, that
it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And is this primarily composition, or do you still have piano students as well, like online?
I haven't played piano enough for a long time. No, it's mostly like harmony, counterpoint, composition. that area of things, writing skills and composition, that stuff.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And with the YouTube channel, so I mean, it looks like you're pretty active with it, like almost weekly, right? Or a couple times a week.
Yeah, well, it depends. The applied harmony course I'm doing with a friend of mine, Andrew Shartman. So that is both of us. The other ones are all just me. Okay. Applied harmony, some of the lessons he writes, some of them I write. So sometimes if you see two in a row, it might be that one of them came from him. Like I might not have written two lessons. I might have just put up an applied orchestration lesson, and he's doing a harmony lesson. Sometimes it's me. So it's a little bit unequal. It depends, because also he's busy too. He has a full-time job. But but it's moving along. I say, like, now that I'm retired, like, when I get up in the morning, it's one of the things that I look to do. Today I worked on the next applied orchestration lesson. That was today's work, this morning. So when, most of the time I'm working on something, I try and get out at least a couple per month, sometimes more, but depending what's happening. But it's fun.
Is this something where you're taking from your lectures during your time teaching in university?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is similar material. Some ideas I have now that I didn't have then. And also, the online thing, generally, most of the time, they're very short. We're talking 10, 15 minutes, right? So, it tends to be very focused on one single thing. Lectures in classroom were like 3 hours long. That's like a different game, But a lot of the content is similar, though. It's a similar kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So, it's the same thing I've been interested in all along.
There's a really great series that you have. I mean, like the applied harmony one, and the analysis for composers one, I thought was a really fascinating idea. You're sort of putting into video format a lot of the stuff you talk about in your book and everything. But even more than that too.
Well, because I found a lot of the analysis courses that I took myself in the old days, they were, like I said, first of all, they focused too much on what you could see as opposed to what you could hear. And also they weren't all that relevant to composers. Sometimes you're thinking like, okay, but what does this have to do with me? But actually, if you try to see things in this style neutral way, it's fairly easy to make them relevant. You just have to sort of say it. Like, oh, here's an example of Mozart doing your climax. How does he do it? Could you use that? And yes, you can. You don't have to write the same style as Mozart to use some of those techniques, but you just have to think about it that way. So if you look at it just as a matter of learning Mozart's style, which is okay, you're not going to generalize it. But if you think of it like, how did he do that transition? How did he do that climax? Well, that's the kind of thing where, it could very well transfer very well to other subjects. It doesn't have to be one single thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think, that's why I called it analysis for composers.
Mm-hmm.
I did at the university, and I could do, maybe I'll do someday, a course called analysis for performers, because performers also often take an analysis course and they think like, yeah, and it's so easy to make it relevant, because just to say, well, what should a performer do here to bring out this or that thing? And in the class, I would actually have students come up on the stage and we would play a piece that they were learning. And we talk about like, okay, if we analyze this piece, what should so-and-so be emphasizing more? Are they making too much of a retardando here? I mean, just basically talking about how to make a better performance based on your understanding of the piece. That was kind of fun also, because like too many analysis courses are just called analysis. All right. But it's kind of, like I said, they don't seem connected to anything. I'm sort of allergic to that.
I can understand that too. Yeah, well, especially with if a lot of people just sort of think about analysis based on harmony and pitch.
Yeah, that's just one part of things. I mean, it's important, but there's many other things to talk about. Often it's not even the most important thing. It's the interaction. Music, counterpoint, and harmony, and orchestration are not all separate. You just teach them separately at the beginning because you can't think of 20 things at once. But eventually harmony has to become counterpoint, and counterpoint has to turn into, because you can't, what's the difference between counterpoint for choir and counterpoint for 5 different instruments? The big difference, because if you have one part is the oboe, another part is a violin, another one is a trumpet, well, those instruments really, they don't blend. You're going to hear dependent lines. If you put the same 3 parts for choir, they're much more blended. So it's the same counterpoint, but the effect is not the same. And it's the same thing with harmony and so on. So ultimately, all those things should converge. You don't have 3 different brains. You don't have a harmony brain, a counterpoint brain. It's the same brain, and eventually you have to sort of understand how they come together.
Yeah, that's exactly that makes a lot of sense.
That's what I think anyway. Again, a lot of times, because I also learned these things like everybody else did, sort of separate. And eventually I started thinking like, is that, when once you ask the question, the answer isn't that hard. It's just, you have to ask the question. Like if somebody never says, well, do counterpoint and harmony, how do they relate to each other? Once you start thinking, it's not going to take you five years to figure it out. But if you don't ask the question, you just figure, okay, I learned the harmony rules and the counterpoint rules and the orchestration rules. But that's not where it's at.
And a lot of students too, I know they get kind of stuck on the idea that there are rules when learning it.
Yeah, well, I guess the principles are better because, parallel fifths and direct fifths, those are examples of holes, bumps and holes, those are holes. So if it makes a hole in the texture, however, if you're playing a Debussy piece, which has a ton of parallel fifths, actually there a third would be a hole. The parallel fifths would be normal and maybe a third would stick out. So it's not the parallel fifths themselves are mortal sin. It's more a matter of like, in the context, what sticks out, what's boring.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because he extensively used fifths, especially in the piano music.
Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, all these, different in medieval period also you had parallel fifths and parallel fourths.
Right.
Maybe they're morally wrong.
Right.
Just if in the wrong context, they're going to sound like if you take in the middle of a Bach chorale and you put in a couple of parallel fifths, it's going to sound like just a dumb sort of empty moment. But like I say, if you take a piece of Debussy, you stuck in a bunch of parallel thirds, sometimes that would sound wrong. Mm-hmm. So, it's really in the context, what's a bump, what's a hole.
Right. Yeah. Based on the sort of character and environment that you're establishing.
When you listen to a piece of music, it takes you a few seconds to sort of deduce, I'm going to say the language or the sort of the norms. Okay. It doesn't take you an hour. Usually within a minute or two, you're starting to develop expectations. That's the same thing that makes us think that there are planets that are shaped like vegetables, solar systems, named after people. It's all bullshit, but the brain is a pattern seeing machine. Like it or not, we're seeing patterns it might be bullshit patterns, but we're seeing patterns all the time. So when you listen to a piece of music, you're looking for patterns, even if you don't want to, you can't help it, is that your brain is going to do it anyway. That's just because if you don't notice patterns, you would have been killed by a lion. Now you have enough sense. If you notice the lion coming far away, you don't spend 20 minutes thinking, I wonder if the lion is going to hurt me. You figure the lion is far away. Enough evolution has done enough for you that like when you figure the lion is coming towards you, you're going to get off your ass and move.
Right.
Evolution is taken care of. And what evolution did is it gave us this very, very strong pattern seeking thing. And again, often we see bullshit patterns, but it's better to see too many of them and live than not see enough of them and die. So it just worked out that way. So that's why, the brain is a pattern seeker. That's one of the main things the brain is set to do. And it certainly does that in music.
That's sort of fascinating to think about where in something like music or film or anything that's a form of entertainment, the like survival instinct of recognizing where patterns are broken is what kicks in that creates interest.
Yeah, I mean, any story you read or you see in a film, I mean, any story starts with a problem. If the film started off, they live and then they lived happily ever after, would you really feel like watching anything else after that? Watch 2 hours of people living happily ever after, and you're like, okay, sounds kind of boring to me. So you have to start off with some kind of problem or question, and then things work out or don't work out. But then you're sort of in this, you've got your thinking about, okay, given this pattern, I think this will go this, or go that way. Then a million things can happen. You watch any TV program or something or any film, they get you thinking about something, and then you may be surprised. There's a lot of surprises, but the surprises don't exist if you don't see any patterns.
Yeah.
So surprise means you had some expectations and they're broken.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting sort of connection to make. I'm kind of curious with your own personal process of composing and stuff. What sort of what's that?
Sketches. Yeah, they just make little sketches. My house was in a big fire, so I don't have all my stuff here, but I'm living in a rented house for now. But yeah, I have a big pile of stuff, sketches that I made at all ages. It could be like 4 bars of music or just a little idea. If I'm not reading it, I'll just sort of stick it in the folder, the sketch folder, and then, at some point it'll end up being useful for something. Just sketches, and then the sketches, then you can develop them, but the sketches, just little bits of things that could be fun. Like on my computer, I have a file called sketches.
Mhm.
You know, just little, and it's not one piece, it's little bits and pieces of things that at some point I hope to use somewhere.
So with the sketches that you make, do you find when you're working on a piece, do you you'll go into your arsenal and see, oh, this might connect with this really well, or do you just take one sketch and like, let me see if I can elaborate this?
No, this was another one inspired. There's a famous story about Stravinsky. Elliott Carter was visiting Stravinsky. So he asked to go into his workroom, Stravinsky's workroom where he composed, okay? Stravinsky had one of these drafting tables, a sort of big table, kind of slanted like that, you know? This is obviously before computers. So Carter sees on the table, like there's like 7 or 8 sketches, and they're all sort of like little pieces of paper. And Stravinsky's like juggling them around, which is this one, right? So like he's sort of saying, I wonder if this would fit better. Nah, oh, but that goes well after that. You should just experiment with these little bits of music. Now, Chris Stravinsky does a lot of cross-cutting, so you can see it. But the basic idea is just trying out stuff, you know? Try something, nah, this doesn't go well after that, but that could be great. Or maybe that's better, you know, you just play with it. I mean, sometimes the continuation will just strike you right away, but if not, sometimes you just play with the sketches. And you know, there's an element of chance, but it's controlled chance. You know, the sketches by themselves have to have a certain interest, and then you're sort of playing with what you've got. And at some point, somebody's going to go, you're going to be like, yeah, that's good. Whereas that, not so hot, you know. So that I think, I didn't invent that. I mean, Beethoven sketches are famous, and Bach made sketch. You know, any composer did some kind of sketch, some of it in their head, but some of it they wrote on paper, and we have some of those papers, so it's obvious that they were trying things out and rejecting things too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny hearing you say that, because the composition instructor I mentioned earlier, her name is Eleni Lilios, the one who recommended the colored pencils and stuff. She also did something similar, where she showed me like where she'll have her draft written out, and then she'll take scissors and just cut little motives and move them around. Yeah. Literally what you're saying Stravinsky did.
I mean, that was the cool thing about that story from Carter. Was, you know, it never occurred to me. You think of it, if you try it, you'd be amazed what it can give you. You know, because you're just fooling around, and it's kind of, you're playing around, but at some point something is going to, that, you know, it's like you're having a conversation with somebody and they say one thing and you think, about that, I want to know more about that. You know, it just strikes you that way. So, you know, again, I didn't invent it. It's a very, you know, I learned the sketching thing from Diamond. I didn't even know about that when I started studying with David Diamond at Juilliard. Like he said, just bring in sketches for a few months. You know, so I'd bring in 10 bars of music and we talk about how it could be developed. That was nice. I'd never thought of that before. You know, none of the people in the past ever mentioned such a thing. I have to go fairly soon. So did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
Oh, no, we can cut it off right there. I appreciate your time so much and everything that you've been saying, Alan. This has been fantastic.
I'm glad you find it of use. Okay. So
yeah.
You know when it's going to go up? I guess you have to do a little bit of editing anyway, but then.
Yeah. So what I'll do, I'll be posting this in 2 weeks. Monday, not Monday coming up, but the following Monday.
Okay, well, just let me know. I added you as a friend on Facebook, so you can just send me a message on Facebook or email or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, that's fantastic. Before we sign off, is there any way that you would like people to kind of find you on your website or anything, or like where can they reach out to you if they want to?
When you put it up, I'll put it up on my Facebook page because I have like over 1,000 Facebook friends who will notice it, so that'll probably get some interest.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, well, Alan, thank you so much for being on here. I've had such a great time talking to you.
Okay, nice to meet you. We'll talk again sometime.